this book, the Decameron, is set during these times in Europe, right? And like I said, and like we've experienced, Boccaccio does a better job describing what is happening in these cities than I ever could. This plague disrupted medieval Europe completely. And it was devastating, it was bleak, it was awful, it was death everywhere. It went unchecked, right? They didn't have the medicine, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the knowledge to even manage a tiny part of this plague. Eventually, that disruption mattered hugely in terms of Western history. What it did in the immediate aftermath of the Black Plague is the eradication of serfdom, because there's so few farmers left alive that the ones that are can demand wages. It creates a society, or a society arises out of this like Black Death situation, in which there's like a ton more social mobility. There's a lot more movement. There's a lot more money. Women get some rights in terms of property, especially if they have husbands or fathers who died. You could easily argue that the Black Death indirectly led to the end of the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages in history is seen as ending with the Renaissance, right? And I think you see those trends in Boccaccio. It's important to note in these plague times, when now we're all quarantining, we're worried about stacks of dead people, we're worried about hospital ventilators and social distance and all of these things, that out of this chaos in this particular historical moment flowered something hugely beautiful, A, but also B, hugely formative for the culture that we currently enjoy and experience. And if the Black Death hadn't happened, we would not have the society that we have today. Okay, so let's talk Boccaccio. Who was he? I don't really know. I think you could probably Google it. I do know that Chaucer stole the structure for the Canterbury Tales from Boccaccio, because the Decameron is set up like this. Like, dark plague is happening. In the middle of this plague, these 7 beautiful women and 3 beautiful men who are wealthy and have country homes, and who knows why they're still in the city, but they're looking around at all the dead people outside of their house, and they say, oh, this is the worst. Let's get out of here, guys.
Bye, bitch.
And so they all go. They go to this beautiful country house. There are servants. They are isolated. Essentially, the Decameron is a story of 10 beautiful, young, wealthy people in self-quarantine. They're practicing social distancing, but they're bored. It's the 14th century. There's no video games. There's no internet. They don't know what to do. So they decide, oh, let's tell stories. And what they do is they elect one person to be king or queen for the day. That person gets to boss all the other people around. And the first queen says, let's sit around and tell stories. And then they decide, let's tell stories with themes. So the Decameron is essentially a book of 100 stories. These 10 beautiful young people tell stories for 2 weeks, but they skip 4 days because of religious holidays. So it's a book of 100 stories, fairly short, very readable. And they talk about things like love, class, religion, many stories about clever people outwitting other people. Just some lovely stories. And this book is considered to be like a classic of Italian prose. Like, it's a big deal book in terms of classic literature. But what I thought was really remarkable about it touches on what we can look at coming out of this kind of plague situation, right? Which is this kind of underlying humanism. One thing Boccaccio does really well that other books of his time don't necessarily do is that he really focuses on like the love between men and women rather than the love between people and God. And in fact, a lot of the more religious stories talk about the benevolence of God and the mercy of God and all of that, but they do kind of lambast the clergy, they lambast the ruling class, and that's reflective of what happened after the bubonic plague, right? Like, bubonic plague decimates Europe, everyone's dead, and people stop trusting authority. People say, F this, like, God isn't taking care of us, the king isn't taking care of us, no one gives an ish. Like, so what do we do? You can see the precursor to humanism happening in Boccaccio, which is just lovely. There are some problematic things in it. I'll gloss over them, but I also don't want to go in too deep. Because I do think this is a beautiful book, and I think there's a million reasons to read it. But I came up with kind of a list of 4 or 5 reasons to read it. So the first reason to read it is if you have time to kill. This one is hefty. Whew. And it's, look at how small that print is, right? I loved it. I thought it was an enjoyable way to kill some time. What is particularly fun about it is that kind of the chapter announcements work like Friends episodes titled, oh, the one where Rachel meets a man, the one where the gang goes to whatever. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia does that too. But that's inspired by Boccaccio, whose chapter titles are just succinct summations of plot. It's a fun book. It's a little bit escapist fantasy. You know, I found myself being so jealous of these beautiful meals in this Italian villa, this just gorgeous quarantine time. These fancy Italian patricians are enjoying on their self-quarantine. Like, here we are eating mac and cheese, right? I also think, though, it's a really good book if you are looking for a quarantine party game. One thing I do think we should bring back with our social distancing, our working from home, our lack of kind of social engagement is storytelling. And what better way than to pick a theme from the Decameron and challenge all your friends to tell a story about it. So I think you could totally jack some of Boccaccio's story ideas and challenge your friends to tell stories. That would be fun. It would be a good YouTube channel. I also think if you are nervous and scared about crisis times, this is a valuable book to read because, again, you can see these shifting values in it. And you can see kind of the way that thinking changes. And, you know, I don't want to be so grandiose as to claim, oh, reading the Decameron shows you how coming through coronavirus will, you know, usher in a new epoch of just benevolent humanity, right? But I do think that it's useful to think about how economically we talk about disruption a lot. And in the tech industry, oh, it's all about disrupt. That's what Uber did. Think about, well, this is a situation, a plague disrupts our sense of normalcy. It disrupts our social structures. It kind of disrupts everything. And from disruption, sometimes really good and really beautiful things can take root. And I think you can see that in the Decameron, which is lovely in a time like this. And again, if you're anxious, if you're worried, read this book. It's solid escapist literature. Once you get through the introduction, you don't get a lot of like yicky plague details anymore. I also think too that this book is particularly relevant given the role that Italy is playing in this global crisis, right? Like, how many times have I heard people say, oh, America, we're 2 weeks behind Italy. And every time I open my phone to look at news threads and news feeds, I see, oh, Italy is having to choose who gets ventilators, and everyone over 80 is dying, and here's this huge death rate, and 21,000 new cases, whatever. Like, just, and I think that this is a great book to be reminded of Italy's kind of historical majesty, the tenacity and beauty of the country, the cultural contributions of it cannot be understated. I hope most of us are familiar with very famous Italian Renaissance artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, etc. Rome is a big deal. We don't read a lot of Italian books. I have another Italian author on my list of plague books that I'll be talking about in a few weeks. But I do think that it's lovely to be reminded of kind of how Italy has dealt with this before and how Italy will be all right. And finally, if you're curious about the Middle Ages, this is a lovely book to read. This translation particularly is very easy to read, super user-friendly. I think most translations of this book are at this point. I don't think it's necessarily the same for the English equivalent, which is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But this book it's super readable. And it's interesting. You get some glimpses into class structures, ideas, beliefs, cultural values, etc. of the Middle Ages. So this is a good book to read during plague times. Boccaccio's Decameron. Enjoy. See you guys next time. Like and subscribe.